Before GPS and fiber optics, we listened to the sky with massive dishes in the middle of nowhere. Tracking stations that watched for missiles, monitored satellites, and searched for signals from deep space. Most of those stations are dark, now decommissioned, abandoned, their dishes pointed at empty air. But a few are still powered. The people who've walked into those silent control rooms will tell you, the signals never stopped. Welcome to True Terraphiles Official. Satellite tracking stations were built in the loneliest places on Earth. High deserts, volcanic ridges, frozen tundra. The technicians who staffed them spent months in isolation, their only companions, the hum of equipment and the endless sweep of the spectrum analyzer. They recorded signals, logged anomalies, and filed reports no one ever read. When the stations were decommissioned, most of the equipment was ripped out, not all of it. Some consoles remained still wired, still humming on backup power no one knew existed, and a few of those consoles are still receiving tonight. 3 people who entered these abandoned cathedrals of the cold war share the moments they realized the dishes weren't just listening, they were waiting. The technician in Hawaii who found a spectrum analyzer displaying a signal that couldn't exist. A night guard in New Mexico who played an old reel-to-reel tape and heard her own voice. And a surveyor in Georgia who climbed a dish and discovered it was already tracking something overhead. Let's open the door. Keola Mahalona was an electronics technician with the Air Force, assigned to decommission the Kaʻena point tracking station, a relic of the 1960s that had monitored Soviet missile tests and early deep satellites until it was shuttered in 1985. The site had been locked up for nearly 4 decades. The dish frozen in its last azimuth, the control room buried in dust. Keola's job was simple: inventory any remaining equipment for potential museum pieces, then oversee the dismantling. He cut the padlock on the heavy steel door and stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across a room frozen in time. Consoles with analog dials and toggle switches, a massive spectrum analyzer with a green phosphor screen, racks of vacuum tube amplifiers. Everything was covered in a thick layer of gray dust that rose in clouds with every step. The air smelled of old electronics, ozone, and the faint salt of the nearby ocean. He walked to the main operations console and sat in the cracked vinyl chair. He flipped a toggle switch on the spectrum analyzer, expecting nothing. The screen flickered. The green sweep line appeared, tracing a flat baseline. Keola stared. The station had been disconnected from the power grid in the 80s, but the analyzer was running. A low hum filled the room as ancient capacitors charged. He watched the baseline, fascinated, and then a spike appeared, single sharp peak, centered at 2.4 gigahertz. It pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. Keola adjusted the gain. The signal grew stronger, cleaner. It wasn't noise. It was a pattern. Deliberate. He keyed his radio to call his supervisor back at the base, but the radio was dead. He tried his cell phone. No signal. The spectrum analyzer speaker crackled to life, a voice emerging from the static. It was tinny, distorted, but unmistakably human, speaking English with an accent he couldn't place. Kaʻena Point, this is Relay 7. We have acquired your reference signal. Continue transmitting. We are calibrating the beam. Over. The transmission ended. Keola sat frozen. Relay 7 didn't exist. The Kaʻena Point station wasn't transmitting. It was a passive receiving site. He checked the transmitter logs on the console. According to the ancient paper rolls, the station's dish had been actively transmitting a signal on 2.4 gigahertz for the last 37 years. Powered by a backup generator he didn't know existed, and a source that the logs labeled simply Automated Response Program Delta. He leaned forward, scanning the log. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. It read, Relay 7 contact confirmed. Beam alignment optimal. Receiving calibration data. He looked out the grimy window at the dish. It was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the massive antenna was rotating, adjusting its azimuth. The servo motors, which hadn't been serviced since the Ford administration, were grinding to life. The spectrum analyzer screamed, a spike of noise so loud he clutched his ears. Then a new voice, clearer, colder, coming not from the speaker but from the very walls of the building, resonating through the metal. Transmission received. Calibration complete. Target acquired. We have a lock on your position. Kaʻena didn't wait to find out whose position they'd locked. He ran out the door, past the dish into his truck. The engine turned over, and he sped down the rutted dirt road, the station shrinking in his rearview mirror. In the mirror, he saw the dish was now pointed directly at his truck, the feed horn glowing with a faint, sickly blue light. He drove all the way to the base, his hands shaking, and told his CO the site was unsafe due to structural decay. Recommended immediate demolition without salvage. He didn't mention the signal, he didn't mention the voice, but he researched Program Delta later. It was a classified project from 1968, an automated system designed to respond to deep space signals and maintain a constant beacon for an undisclosed recipient. Program was officially terminated in 1972. But the Kaʻena point station never got the termination order. And Kaʻena knows the dish is still out there, still transmitting, still waiting for a reply. Sometimes when he passes a satellite dish on a rooftop, he wonders if every dish in the world is part of the same network now, and whether the calibration beam has locked onto him. Orion Dupuis had been a night security guard at the White Sands missile range for 2 years, but she'd never been assigned to the old Telemetry Annex before. It was a remote building on the edge of the range, once used to record data from missile tests and satellite passes, now used mostly for storage. Her job was to walk the perimeter, check the locks, and log her rounds. The building was a single-story concrete box with a small control room that still housed banks of reel-to-reel tape machines, their reels empty, their heads dusty. On a breezy October night, with the wind moaning through the vents, Orion noticed a tape still loaded on one of the machines. It was an old 10-inch metal reel, its label yellowed and peeling. She could just make out the handwritten date, April 12th, 1981. The erased calibration reference, do not erase. She was curious. The machine was still plugged into a power strip, and when she flipped the power switch, the tubes glowed orange. She threaded the tape, pressed play. The reels began to turn. The speaker crackled. A voice emerged, a woman's voice, calm and professional. White Sands Telemetry Annex. Calibration test number 3. Signal strength nominal. Standing by. Orion froze. The voice was her own. Not similar, identical. The same cadence, the same accent, the same slightly nasal tone she heard every time she listened to her own voicemail greeting. But she hadn't been born in 1981. She hadn't even been in New Mexico then. She'd grown up in Baton Rouge, and she'd never recorded a calibration tape in her life. She reached to stop the tape. Before she could, the voice continued, "I'm inside now. The door is locked. They told me to keep recording until the event. If you're hearing this, the event has already happened. Don't turn off the tape. They'll know." Orian's hand hovered over the stop button. Her voice was trembling now. I can see the dish moving. It's tracking something that isn't in the catalog. The signal is modulating. It's forming words. It's saying my name. There was a long pause, filled with static and a faint, high-pitched whine. Then her voice returned, barely a whisper. It's inside me now. It hears you. The tape stopped. The reels ceased turning. The speaker went silent. Orianne stood in the dark control room, her own heartbeat the only sound. Then the spectrum analyzer on the adjacent console flickered to life, its green screen tracing a peak. The speaker in that console crackled, and her voice, the same voice, calm against, I'm still here. The calibration was successful. The program is complete. We are ready. She yanked the power cord from the wall. The screen died. The speaker went silent. But the tape machine kept turning, the reels spinning backward, rewinding on their own. Orianne didn't stay to see what would happen next. Locked the doors and drove straight to the main gate. She told her supervisor. The Annex had suffered a power surge and was a fire hazard. She requested it be disconnected from the grid and permanently sealed. She never told anyone about the tape. Yes, but she looked up the Annex's operational records later. In April 1981, a technician named Elaine Marchetti was stationed at the White Sands Telemetry Annex for a classified calibration test. She was the only person on duty. The test was never concluded. Elaine Marchetti disappeared. The official report said she'd wandered into the desert during a sandstorm and was presumed dead. But her body was never found. Orianne knows where Elaine went. She knows she was absorbed into a program that never ended, a signal that never stopped transmitting. And she knows that somewhere in a dark room filled with spinning reels, her own voice is still recording, still waiting, still watching whoever listens. Lauren Petrov was a site surveyor for a defense contractor tasked with evaluating the Pine Bluff satellite calibration site for possible reactivation. The site had been built in 1963 to calibrate the telemetry of early reconnaissance satellites. It's a massive dish aimed at geostationary orbit, abandoned in 1997 when the program migrated to newer facilities. His job was to assess the structural integrity of the dish and the control building. He arrived in late afternoon, the sun filtering through the pines, the air thick with humidity and the scent of pine sap. The control building was a squat cinder block box with a single room filled with dusty consoles and a large window overlooking the dish. The dish itself was a 100-foot parabolic antenna, its surface covered in peeling paint and bird droppings. He climbed the metal ladder bolted to the support structure, his boots clanging on the rungs. At the top, the feed horn hung on a gimbal, its cables frayed, its electronics exposed. Lauren inspected the connections, making notes. He glanced down at the dish surface. The entire parabola was filled with a shallow pool of stagnant rainwater that reflected the evening sky. And in that reflection, he saw something that wasn't there. A shape, moving across the dish like a shadow, but with no physical source. He looked up at the sky. Nothing. He looked back at the water. The shape was still there, a dark, angular silhouette that drifted slowly across the dish's surface, as if something were passing overhead, blotting out a sun that was already below the horizon. He climbed down quickly, his heart pounding, and went back into the control building. He flipped open his laptop to check the site's historical logs. The console in front of him, which he'd assumed was dead, flickered to life. A screen that hadn't been powered in over 20 years displayed a string of numbers. Azimuth, elevation, signal strength. The dish was actively tracking something, and the signal strength was rising. Lauren looked out the window. The dish was moving, the massive counterweights groaning, the rusted gears grinding. It pivoted toward the southern sky, the feed horn tilting upward. The pool of water on the dish's surface rippled, and the shadow he'd seen grew larger, more defined, an elongated triangle, perfectly black, blocking out the reflection of the emerging stars. He heard a voice, not through a speaker, but through the very glass of the window, vibrating the pane. Pine Bluff, we have your uplink. Telemetry is within parameters. You have been selected as a primary calibration node. Prepare for data transfer. Lauren's laptop screen flickered and then displayed a new window, a series of coordinates and a countdown timer. 11 minutes. The console screen showed the dish rotating to a precise azimuth, locking onto a geostationary point. The shadow on the dish was now fully formed, a perfect black triangle, its edges sharp, its center a void that seemed to absorb the light. Lauren grabbed his radio to call for extraction, but the radio only emitted a series of clicks and a distorted voice that might have been his own, looped back from some far distance. He ran out of the building. The dish's feed horn began to glow, a brilliant blue-white light that cast long shadows through the pines. The shadow on the dish was sinking into the water, merging with the reflection, becoming something physical. A tendril of darkness reached up from the dish's surface, testing the air like a blind snake. Lauren didn't wait. He sprinted to his truck and drove, the glow of the dish illuminating the forest behind him. In the rearview mirror, he saw the beam. A column of light shooting straight up from the feed horn into the sky, so bright it turned the night to day for a split second. Then the beam cut off, and the forest was dark again. Lauren reported the site as catastrophically unstable, recommend fueler demolition. He never explained why. But he researched the Pine Bluff site. In 1974, a team of 4 calibration specialists vanished from the station. Their logs described an anomalous return signal and a physical manifestation of telemetry data. The last entry said simply, "The dish is receiving what it transmits. We are in the beam. It sees us." The site was sealed. Lauren knows what the dish was tracking. He knows the shadow in the water wasn't a cloud or a satellite. And he knows the calibration program never ended, just needed a new node. The countdown on his laptop, it reached 0 2 days after he fled, and his screen still flickers sometimes, displaying that same string of coordinates updated every day. Somewhere, a dish is still pointed at him, still waiting, still calibrating. 3. Tracking stations. 3 abandoned dishes. And 3 signals that should have gone silent decades ago. Keola Mahalona found a spectrum analyzer still running on a program that never got the termination order, and a dish that locked onto him the moment he entered the room. Oriane Dupuis played a tape recorded 20 years before her birth and heard her own voice warning her not to stop the machine because the signal was already inside. Lauren Petrov watched a dish track a shadow in the sky and discovered the calibration node was still active, still looking for operators to absorb. The old tracking stations are still out there, their dishes frozen in place, their consoles gathering dust. But the next time you see an abandoned antenna on a remote hilltop, remember, some signals never stop transmitting, and some responses are still being received. This has been True Terror Files Official. If you've ever worked at a remote monitoring site or picked up a transmission you couldn't explain, drop your story in the comments. We read every single one. Like, subscribe, ring that bell. If you ever walk into an old control room and see a green screen flickering, maybe don't touch the console. The dish is still listening. So is whatever's on the other end.